They laughed when he said he would build a tank. A farmer, a man with rough hands and a stubborn heart, standing in a half-broken barn outside Odessa, staring at an old tractor covered in mud and rust. It was July 1941. The summer smelled of dust and gunpowder. The German army was moving fast across Ukraine, faster than anyone thought possible. Towns fell like dominoes. Fields burned. Families fled. And yet, in this forgotten corner of the steppe, one man refused to run. His name was Ivan Malenko, a farmer and mechanic, one of the thousands who fed the Red Army, repaired tractors, and lived their entire lives on soil that now trembled under the boots of invasion. He had never held a rifle, never worn a uniform. But when the front collapsed and his sons marched away, something inside him changed. He looked at his tractor, the only machine left, and whispered, "If they have tanks, so will we." At first, the villagers thought he was losing his mind. The German tanks were steel beasts, Panzer IIIs, IVs, with thick armor, roaring engines, and trained crews. Ivan's tractor was a creaking piece of iron that coughed smoke and barely plowed through dry earth. But Ivan had one thing the Germans didn't: desperation. And in war, desperation can be more powerful than an army. He began stripping the machine down piece by piece. At dawn, he hammered steel plates taken from abandoned rail wagons. At night, he welded them together by the light of a single oil lamp, sparks flashing against the barn walls. He replaced the wooden cabin with a crude steel box, layered with sandbags for protection. His neighbors shook their heads. "He's building a coffin," they said. "A tractor cannot stop a panzer." But Ivan didn't stop. Every sound of artillery in the distance reminded him why. Every story of villages burned, every whisper about soldiers executed, fed his anger like coal into a furnace. He had one helper, Nikolai, a teenage blacksmith's apprentice who had lost his father at the front. Together, they scoured scrapyards and abandoned workshops, collecting old tank treads, fuel drums, anything made of metal. They found a pair of machine guns left behind by retreating soldiers. Rusted, jammed, but not dead. Ivan cleaned them with kerosene, reassembled them with trembling hands. When he pulled the trigger and heard the dry click, he smiled for the first time in weeks. "She still breathes," he said quietly. "We'll make her raw." By August, the Germans were closing in on Odessa. Columns of smoke rose on the horizon like black rivers flowing into the sky. The city's defenders, soldiers, sailors, and civilians, were preparing for siege. Word of Ivan's tank spread among them like a rumor too strange to ignore. A group of soldiers came to see it one evening. They laughed. "What is this? A toy for the kolkhoz parade. You'll scare them with your jokes, not your bullets." Ivan said nothing. He just turned the key and pressed the starter. The engine roared, louder than it ever had before. The entire barn shook. The soldiers' laughter stopped. Thick black smoke poured from the exhaust. The steel plates rattled like chains of armor. The machine lurched forward, crushing a pile of scrap beneath its tracks. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't fast. But it was alive. And for the first time, those men who had seen real tanks, real war, looked at this farmer and didn't laugh. They saluted him. Night fell over the steppe. Ivan sat beside his creation, oil stains covering his arms, eyes glowing from the reflection of the engine's fire. He didn't see a tractor anymore. He saw hope, hope made of steel and stubbornness. He named it the Little Brother. Because, as he told Nikolai, the Red Army has their big brothers, T-34s and KVs. But we'll fight with what we have. The machine had no official armor. The plates were uneven, some welded crooked. The gun turret was a salvaged water tank with a cutout for the machine gun. But it moved, and when Ivan drove it across the field, children ran after it cheering. They didn't see a farmer anymore. They saw a soldier, one who refused to surrender. The next morning, Odessa radio announced, "The German advance has reached the outskirts. All civilians must evacuate." But Ivan stayed. His wife begged him to come. "You can't stop an army with a tractor." He just looked at her with tired eyes and said, "Maybe not, but maybe I can slow them down." She pressed a small icon of St. Nicholas into his hand, a talisman for protection. Then she left with the others, her figure fading into the dust of retreating crowds. Ivan climbed into his armored tractor, the metal hot under the rising sun. He looked toward the horizon, where smoke and thunder rolled like a storm. The first German tanks had appeared. He gripped the control levers, his knuckles white. Somewhere deep in the machine, the old engine coughed, then growled to life. He smiled. Let's see if they still laugh. The German columns came like thunder. Dust rose from the roads for miles, and the sound of engines carried through the valleys long before the first tanks appeared. Odessa, the proud port city on the Black Sea, was surrounded. Inside the city, soldiers fortified trenches, sailors turned their ship guns inland, and civilians, anyone strong enough to carry a hammer or a rifle, joined the defense. And somewhere outside the city, hidden beneath a collapsed barn roof, Ivan's little brother waited. He had spent the last of his fuel to bring it here. The engine wheezed, the armor rattled, and the old farmer's hands shook from exhaustion. He hadn't slept in 2 days. His eyes were red from smoke and oil. But his heart, it beat like a drum. He looked at Nikolai. The boy's face was pale, but his eyes burned. "They're close," he said. "The soldiers want us to move it to the front." Ivan nodded slowly. "Then we go." When they arrived at the edge of the city, a group of Red Army engineers stared in disbelief. The machine looked like something out of a child's imagination. Thick, uneven metal plates, scorched edges, a turret welded from a water tank, and an engine that screamed like it was in pain. One of the engineers muttered, "What is this, a tank or a coffin?" Another laughed. "You think that thing can fight? It can't even turn." Ivan didn't answer. He just drove it forward, the ground trembling beneath the heavy treads. He pointed to the horizon, where the black silhouettes of German tanks glimmered in the heat. "We'll find out soon enough." The men stopped laughing. That evening, a small detachment of soldiers joined Ivan near a half-destroyed factory on the outskirts. They were low on ammunition, exhausted, but determined to hold their line. They dug trenches behind broken walls, placed anti-tank mines, and prepared Molotov cocktails in bottles marked Odessa vodka. Ivan parked, little brother, beside them. The sun dipped behind the smoke, turning the sky orange and red like fire reflecting off metal. He climbed down, wiped his hands on his dirty coat, and looked at the soldiers. "You keep your rifles ready," he said. "I'll give them something else to shoot at." At dawn, the first panzer column rolled in. The German tanks moved in perfect formation, their armor glinting in the morning light. Behind them came infantry trucks, armored cars, and artillery. They expected resistance, but not from what they saw next. When the first shell hit the factory wall, a massive explosion shook the ground. Dust filled the air. The soldiers inside coughed, blinded. And through that dust came a sound no one expected, a deep metallic roar. The little brother burst through the smoke. Black soot and sparks trailed behind it as it rolled forward, guns blazing. The Germans froze. It wasn't a Soviet tank. It was too small, too misshapen. It looked like a creature of iron, and fire crawling from the earth itself. Some laughed. Some shouted in disbelief. And then it opened fire. The twin machine guns rattled with a deafening roar. Bullets cut through the air, striking a German truck. It burst into flames. The soldiers dove for cover, their laughter turning into panic. Ivan sat hunched inside the steel cabin, sweat dripping from his face. He could barely see through the slit in the armor, just flashes of movement, shadows running. He didn't stop. He pressed forward, closer and closer. A German anti-tank gun swung toward him, a cannon meant to destroy real tanks. The shell hit the side of the little brother. The whole cabin shook. The right plate cracked but held. Ivan's ears rang. He spat blood and shouted, "She's still breathing." He fired again. A second truck exploded. The blast knocked soldiers to the ground. The Germans began to retreat, dragging their wounded behind them. The panzer commander called in artillery, thinking a full Soviet tank unit had arrived. But there was only one farmer, one machine, and one miracle. By the time the shelling stopped, little brother was a wreck. The armor was full of holes, the left track was broken, and the engine coughed out its last breath. Ivan climbed out, coughing, his hands burned, his hair singed. The soldiers rushed to him, cheering. "You stopped them. You made them pull back." Ivan just nodded, staring at the smoke on the horizon. He could still hear the engines retreating. He had bought them hours, maybe a day. And in war, a day could mean everything. Word of the farmer's tank spread like wildfire through Odessa. To the defenders, it became a legend, a story whispered in the trenches. They said it was invincible, that it had crushed a German platoon by itself. Some claimed it was made from the soul of the earth, a machine built by ghosts of the fallen. To the Germans, it was something else entirely, a symbol of madness, of resistance that refused to die. Reports described it as a makeshift armored tractor used in defense of Odessa. But among the soldiers, it was known by another name. Der Eisentier, the Iron Beast. A few days later, a Soviet officer from the Odessa Defense Council visited Ivan's workshop. He was tall, clean, with medals gleaming on his chest. He walked around the burned-out remains of the little brother, inspecting it silently. Finally, he said, "You built this yourself?" "Yes," Ivan replied. "From what was left?" The officer smiled faintly. "And it fought?" "It did," said Ivan. "For as long as it could." The officer nodded, then turned to his aide. "Send word to the factories. They'll need this design." Ivan blinked. "You mean build more?" "We'll build dozens," the officer said. "Maybe hundreds. We'll call them NI1 for Na Isbug." He saw Ivan's confusion and added, "It means for fright. That's what you gave them, fear." That night, Ivan stood outside the factory again, watching the workers gather. Men and women, teenagers, old machinists, all of them holding hammers and torches. They began cutting and welding, just like he had done. Within days, more tractors took shape, crude, ugly, loud, but armed. He realized then, he hadn't just built a machine. He had started something far greater. Days later, Odessa shook again under bombardment. But this time, the city didn't hide. From the factories rolled out a dozen iron beasts, the NI ones, painted dark green, marked with white slogans. "For the motherland, death to fascism, Odessa stands." Each one bore the rough, handmade armor Ivan had pioneered. Each one carried a crew of volunteers, farmers, mechanics, sailors. And when they rolled through the smoke, the German soldiers once again laughed until they fired. The laughter didn't last long. As the last light of evening fell, Ivan watched the conv of his children disappear into the haze. He leaned on his cane, exhausted but proud. Nikolai stood beside him, hands still black with soot. "You did it," he said. Ivan smiled. "No, we did. They thought a farmer couldn't fight a war. Let's show them how wrong they are." He looked to the horizon again, the glow of battle reflected in his eyes like fire in steel. The man who once drove a tractor to feed the land had now built machines to defend it. And somewhere in the distance, the Germans were learning a new truth. That the Soviet earth itself had risen against them. The ground trembled before dawn. The defenders of Odessa could feel it, a low, growing rumble that rolled across the fields like distant thunder. At first, they thought it was artillery. But the sound was uneven, mechanical, heavy, alive. Then, through the morning fog, they appeared. A line of crude steel shapes, smoke curling from their exhaust pipes, treads grinding through the dirt. Some were painted dark green, others grey. One still carried patches of red rust. They looked like monsters crawling out of the sea. The first German scouts froze in disbelief. Through their binoculars, they saw the impossible tractors, but not tractors anymore. They were covered in metal plating, carrying machine guns, some even mounted small cannons. No two were alike, yet all bore the same crude markings, NI-1. "Was ist das?" one German officer muttered. "A new Soviet tank." His comrade shook his head. "No, something worse. Something they built themselves." The German artillery opened fire. Shells whistled through the air, bursting around the slow-moving machines. One NI-1 shuddered under impact, a steel plate flying off its side, but it didn't stop. Another burst through a burning field, its tracks glowing red. And then the guns replied. The tractors roared to life, their machine guns spitting fire. Bullets tore through German infantry lines. The sound was deafening, a mechanical scream mixed with the echo of hundreds of hammers striking steel. Inside one of them sat Ivan Malenko. His hands gripped the controls, trembling from the vibration. He could barely see through the narrow slit, just flashes of smoke, bodies running, explosions lighting the field like lightning. His machine groaned, rattled, but moved forward. He shouted over the roar of the engine. "Hold steady, little brother. One more field." Beside him, Nikolai reloaded the gun, his face pale but determined. "They're running," he yelled. "Good," Ivan said. "Let them remember who taught them fear." The Germans had no idea what to do. Their panzers were fast and powerful, but they had not expected armored tractors rumbling through the smoke at point-blank range. Their shells either overpenetrated the thin plating or missed entirely in the chaos. And when the NI-1s reached their lines, they fired from such close distance that even a bullet from a makeshift gun could tear through armor seams. In the confusion, a German officer tried to rally his men. "They are nothing but tractors. Shoot their engines." But as he shouted, one NI-1 crashed through a wooden barricade, crushing the vehicle beside him. The officer dropped his rifle and ran. By midday, the front near the 6th-kilometer line, once a solid German advance, had fallen into complete disarray. Reports flooded German headquarters. Unknown Soviet tanks broke through infantry positions. Panic among units. Enemy using improvised armored vehicles. No one could understand how a besieged city was fielding new tanks. But it wasn't industry that built them. It was desperation, steel, and a farmer's stubborn will. Ivan's NI-1 had been hit 3 times. The right side armor was cracked, one tread link was hanging loose, and oil leaked like blood. He didn't stop. Through the dust and smoke, he saw the burning silhouettes of German vehicles retreating. One anti-tank gun tried to aim again, but he pressed the lever forward, driving straight at it. The gun fired. The shell hit low, ricocheted, and vanished in a burst of sparks. Before the Germans could reload, the little brother rolled over their position, crushing the cannon under its tracks. Inside, Ivan laughed, not with joy, but disbelief. "She's doing it," he whispered. "She's really doing it." Behind him, more NI-1s followed. From a distance, the sight was almost surreal. 10, maybe 12 crude tanks crawling through fire and smoke, surrounded by cheering infantry. Soldiers who had been retreating now advanced, following behind the mechanical beasts like ancient warriors behind their shields. One shouted for Odessa, for the farmer who built tanks. And that name, the farmer who built tanks, spread faster than the smoke. By nightfall, the story had reached every corner of the city. But war doesn't give heroes time to rest. That evening, the Germans launched another counterattack, heavier, faster, with artillery that shook the ground for miles. The NI-1s had proven terrifying, but they weren't invincible. The next morning, Ivan's workshop was gone, destroyed by a direct hit. He and Nikolai barely escaped with their lives. The blast had thrown them across the yard, shattering glass, twisting metal. When he woke, Ivan's ears rang like church bells. He looked around at the ruins, the ashes, the mangled remains of what once built his miracle. For a moment, he thought it was over. He could run, hide, survive. But then he heard the distant hum, the faint sound of engines again. The NI-1s were rolling to battle. His creations were still fighting. He stood up, every bone aching, and said to Nikolai, "If they can fight, so can we." They made their way back to the front lines. German bombers howled overhead, dropping their payloads across the outskirts. The earth shook. The air smelled of fire and death. But as they reached a hill overlooking the city, Ivan saw something he'd never forget. A single NI-1 stood alone in the field, smoke rising from its side. Its turret was jammed, its treads half broken, but it kept firing again and again against waves of German troops. Every shot was answered by artillery, by fire, by the sound of metal screaming. Yet the machine did not stop. He could see its driver, a young sailor from the harbor brigade, leaning out to reload, his face blackened with soot. Behind him, Odessa's defenders regrouped, using the tank's last stand as cover to pull back the wounded. Ivan clenched his fists. "That's my machine," he whispered. "That's my brother." By nightfall, the NI-1 was gone, reduced to a smoking hulk in the field. But it had delayed the Germans for another day. And one more day meant reinforcements. One more day meant hope. When the Soviet fleet began shelling German positions from the sea, the balance shifted again. The farmers, the sailors, the factory workers, they all fought together, shoulder to shoulder, holding a line that was never meant to hold. And deep within that chaos, the story of the farmer and his tractor spread beyond Odessa. Through whispers, through letters, through exhausted soldiers who told each other stories to keep warm, the tale reached Moscow. It was said that even Stalin himself heard it. The story of a man who built a tank from a tractor and refused to surrender. Weeks later, Odessa still stood, barely bleeding, but unbroken. When the Germans finally retreated months later, they left behind more than ruins, they left behind a legend. Ivan didn't see the retreat. He was found in his barn, repairing what was left of little brother. He had been hit by shrapnel during one of the bombardments. Nikolai stayed by his side until the end. Before he died, Ivan looked at him and whispered, "Don't let them forget. Tell them we fought with what we had." The next day, Nikolai helped push the old machine out of the barn and onto the road. He painted 3 words across its dented armor in white paint, words that would outlive them both. Made in Odessa, the guns finally fell silent. After months of fighting, Odessa stood among ruins, burned buildings, shattered bridges, fields turned to ash. But the city had not surrendered. And in every broken street, in every bunker and trench, people whispered one name, Ivan Malenko, the farmer who had built a tank from nothing. The legend spread faster than any official bulletin. No one could say where it started, perhaps from a sailor who had seen the little brother crush a German cannon, or from a soldier who fought beside one of the makeshift tractors. But by the time the smoke cleared, Ivan's name had become something more than a man. It had become a story. In Moscow, officers of the Soviet High Command reviewed the reports coming from Odessa. At first, they thought it was a mistake. Improvised armored tractors defeating German units. But the evidence was undeniable. Captured German field logs mentioned new armored machines, improvised but effective. The name NI-1 appeared again and again. Within weeks, engineers in several cities, Tbilisi, Stalingrad, even Leningrad, began producing similar vehicles. Some used tractors, others old trucks, all armored with scrap steel and doors from bombed-out buildings. Each bore crude slogans painted by hand. For Odessa. For the farmer. The idea that one man's invention, one act of madness, had inspired an entire army spread like wildfire. Meanwhile, Ivan's little brother was found again, half buried in rubble rusted, the engine long cold. When the Red Army engineers reached Odessa, they dragged the remains to a workshop for study. They called it the People's Tank. It wasn't elegant or powerful or fast, but it was proof that courage could be welded from scrap. They patched its armor, repainted it, and placed it at the city square for all to see. Children climbed on its tracks, veterans saluted it when they passed. Some swore they could still smell the smoke of its last battle. At its base, a plaque was later added. This machine was built by the hands of those who refused to surrender. Nikolai, now just 16, stayed behind to tend the workshop. Every morning, he lit a small fire inside the barn where it all began. The roof was gone, the walls scorched, but the tools were still there. The hammers, the oil cans, the broken welding torch that had once given birth to a legend. He kept them polished, waiting. For what, he didn't know. Maybe for peace. Maybe for Ivan to come, walking through the door again. He never did. But the spirit of the farmer who built a tank lived on in the machines, in the soldiers, in the very soil he had refused to abandon. By 1943, the Soviet Union's factories were back to full strength. Real tanks, thousands of them, rolled off the assembly lines every month. T-34s, KVs, ISs. But among the soldiers who fought at Kursk, at Stalingrad, at Sevastopol, the story of the NI-1 was told like a prayer. They would whisper it before battle. Remember the farmer from Odessa, the one who fought with a tractor. Because in a war that devoured everything, hope, strength, faith, that story reminded them what courage truly was. In Germany, too, the myth of the Iron Farmer took root. Captured soldiers spoke of seeing strange Soviet vehicles that moved like ghosts, slow but unstoppable. Rumors spread through Wehrmacht lines. The Russians were so desperate they were turning farmers into tank builders. To the Germans, it was absurd and terrifying. One report from a German officer read, "The Soviets have begun fielding improvised armored tractors. They are crude, but they advance under fire without fear. It seems madness, but the men believe these are symbols of their will to fight. We call them Iron Farmers." Even the enemy couldn't ignore it anymore. Years later, when the war was over and the world tried to return to normal, the NI-1s were long gone. Most had been melted down for scrap or destroyed in combat. But the memory of them remained in the hearts of those who had seen them rise from the flames. Odessa rebuilt itself from ashes. New factories replaced the old ones. Children grew up playing beside the rusted remains of a single machine that had outlived its creator. And every year, on the day of liberation, an old tradition returned. Farmers would drive their tractors into the city square, freshly painted, decorated with flowers, and place a single red carnation at the base of the little brother. It was their way of saying thank you. Thank you to a man who had proved that even a plow could become a weapon when the soil turned to battlefield. In 1955, a journalist from Moscow arrived to write a story about the legend of the farmer's tank. He found Nikolai, now a grown man, still working at the same workshop, fixing tractors for the new collective farms. The journalist asked, "Is it true? Did one man really build a tank here during the siege?" Nikolai smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "but not just a tank. He built hope." The reporter asked for a photo. Nikolai stood beside the remains of the little brother, his hand resting on the cold steel. In the background, sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting on the armor like a silent salute. The photograph appeared in Pravda weeks later under the headline, "The Man Who Built Steel from Soil." It became one of the most shared wartime stories in the Soviet Union and beyond. Over the years, historians debated whether Ivan's exact tank truly existed as described, whether it was one machine or several, or simply a myth born of war. But in Odessa, no one questioned it, because they had seen it. They had heard it. They had watched it fight when everything else had fallen. And sometimes, that's all that matters. Not the schematics or the records, but the story itself. A story that says even the simplest man can stand against the impossible. Decades later, when the Soviet Union was gone and a new country stood in its place, a museum curator restored the little brother once again. He found old photos, testimonies, and fragments of the original armor. He rebuilt it piece by piece, exactly as it had been described, rough, crooked, uneven. When they unveiled it, veterans stood in silence. Some wept. Others smiled, remembering the sound it made, that terrible, beautiful roar that once echoed through the smoke of Odessa. A small boy tugged at his grandfather's sleeve and asked, "Did it really fight?" The old man nodded. "Yes. And it didn't fight alone. It fought with all of us inside it." Today, historians call the NI-1 the tank that wasn't a tank. It wasn't fast, wasn't strong, and wasn't built in a factory. But it worked. And in doing so, it became something far greater than steel, a symbol of how ingenuity and courage can rise from ruin. Its creator, Ivan Malenko, remains half legend, half man, a name spoken in documentaries and war museums, his photo lost to time, his spirit alive in every tale of defiance. And somewhere, in the archives of the Odessa Museum of Military Glory, a simple plaque still reads, "He had no army. He had no orders. But he had an idea. And with it, he made history." If you stand in that square today, you can still see the rusted silhouette of his little brother. Children play around it, touching the cold steel without knowing whose hands built it. The birds sing over the same fields where engines once screamed. And when the wind blows just right, some say you can still hear the faint rumble of a tractor climbing toward battle. A sound not of war, but of defiance. Of a farmer who refused to give up his land. Of a man who turned his plow into a weapon. And of a story that, against all odds, refused to die. The farmer who built a tank. He didn't just defend a city. He reminded the world that courage doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears work gloves, smells of oil and earth, and drives into battle on tracks it built by hand.